I am so excited about today's discussion. Thank you so much for joining us to talk about Immigration Matters, not just the book, but how the book helps us understand the moment that we're in, the opportunities and the challenges ahead, and most importantly, how we will fight and win. So the essays curated here by my dear friend and mentor, Deepak Bhargava, as well as Penny Lewis and Ruth Milkman from the City University of New York, provide us with a much needed history and perspective on the long fight for immigrant justice, and they offer exciting proposals for the way forward. The book is essential reading for activists and for everyone who cares about justice in our country. So I encourage everyone who has tuned in to pre-order Immigration Matters from your favorite independent bookstore. The publishing date is April 27th, so right around the corner. Now, I want to make sure that during the discussion today, we stay grounded in movement and in the power of our communities to expand the range of what's possible, to imagine a different future, and to build the power to achieve it. Our speakers today have done it all. They've organized, they have led, they have governed, they have run for and won elected office. They have disrupted and transgressed the boundaries of the acceptable. And we need all of this work to achieve the transformation that's so urgently needed in our country. And I am reminded after yesterday's setback in the fight for 15th, just a pause actually, a little roadblock, because we're gonna get there, that even when we face challenges, we organize, we know what we're worth, and we can flex our power and hold all actors accountable. My name is Lorella Praeli. I am president of Community Change Action. And above all, I remain hopeful and I remain resolved to win and deliver for our communities. And what a blessing and a privilege it is to be in conversation with folks who are joining us today. Because after 4 years of Trump and an election that Black, Latinx, API, and Indigenous communities in particular helped to deliver for the Democrats, we believe that we have a once in a generation opportunity to win on immigration. That if we want to build a multiracial majority and you win elections, you've got to actually deliver for the people. So our speakers today need no introduction. They are all veterans in the fight for immigrant justice and racial justice, and they offer a broad range of perspectives from inside government and Congress to policy, organizing and power building. Deepak Bhargava, Congresswoman Jayapal, Cecilia Munoz, Cristina, Jimenez, gracias. Thank you for making the time today. For all of those who have joined us, we'll have about 20 minutes for Q&A at the end. So please use the Q&A function on the Zoom to send in your questions. And one final note, this event will be recorded and made available to the public. So I'm already running over time. I want to kick it off with you, Congresswoman Jayapal, who is one of our movement's most trusted champions in Congress. You were really in the thick of the fight to stop Trump's agenda. And now we have a real opportunity not only to reverse or undo, as you write in the book, Trump's anti-immigrant policies, but also to win meaningful relief for immigrant communities. Now, with several different potential legislative vehicles before Congress, can you talk to us about what you see as the most promising path to get a bold immigration reform bill on the president's desk this year?
Yeah, thank you so much, Lorella. It is so good to see you, and to my dear, dear friend Deepak, who brought me into this amazing book, which I think is just such a remarkable compilation from years of wisdom and organizing and activism and political strategy to really chart a path forward of what we need to do, what we can do, and what we should do. So thank you, Deepak and Cecilia and Cristina. It's so wonderful to be with you. Look, I think that the trauma of the last 4 years has actually helped unify a lot of the country around what is unacceptable. Kids in cages are unacceptable. Family separation is unacceptable. And I think that we have always known that actually the public has been with us on immigration for quite some time. It has never been an issue that is so divisive that people don't want to reform the system. What has happened is that there's been this roadblock in Congress from Republicans and in past years, perhaps bipartisan opposition to really reforming the immigration system in a full and comprehensive way. And so as we look at this moment, I think what we have going for us is the despair of so many communities, immigrant communities across this country that are part and parcel of their local communities. And on the front lines during this COVID pandemic, they have become visible in a new way. Farm workers are visible, of course, to all of us. They have been visible for a very long time. But for a lot of people who are standing in food lines that wrap around the block, now there's an opportunity for them to think about who is it that's putting that food on the table? Who is it that's milking the cows and really standing up the dairy industry? Who is it that's on the front lines of healthcare and home care and taking care of seniors and kids across the country? So that means that our job now is to figure out the legislative process. And I think that we have to go with full pedal to the metal on multiple strategies. Number one, the relief bills and the rescue package that we're gonna pass the relief bill, the American Rescue Plan today in the House, and that and the rescue package that comes forward around jobs and creating jobs and a path to citizenship for essential workers. These are opportunities to move as much benefit to immigrant communities as possible. Second, we know that we have bipartisan support for a number of bills that passed the House last year. That is the Dream and Promise Act, that was HR 6. That is the Farm Worker Modernization Act. That is the No Ban Act and the Access to Counsel Bill. 4 bills that passed the House last year. And according to our new rules in the House, if it passed last year, we call this the McGovern rule, then it does not have to go through committee hearing. And we can actually pass it as long as it passes before April 1st. So we do have an imposed deadline for those 4 bills. And then third, and extremely important, because of the movement, all of you on this call and millions of people across the country, dreamers, immigrant rights groups, we were able to get President Biden to a place where he fully embraced the need for comprehensive immigration reform and came out really swinging with a robust bill on day one. That for short form, I'll call it the Biden bill, which we now have introduced in the House and the Senate. And we need to take it through committee. It is a comprehensive bill. It doesn't have everything in it, but it is important. And we need to push on getting that as far as we can go, as quickly as we can go. So I think none of these individual strategies should stop any of the other strategies from moving forward. It has to be a cohesive push. And then the last thing I'll say is I am really proud to have worked with groups across the country, including Community Change and others, United We Dream, many others, to put together the Roadmap to Freedom Resolution. And that Roadmap to Freedom Resolution has been introduced with colleagues from the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, the Congressional Black Caucus, and the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus. And it is really the North Star visionary set of principles, roadmap to what any kind of humane immigration policy needs to include. Because we all understand, having worked on this issue for so long, that it's complex and there are many, many pieces of it. There's detention reform, there's legalization, there's family reunification, there's the enforcement considerations, so many different pieces that need to be addressed. And so the roadmap sets forth the principles for every single one of those areas and says, no matter what we do, we have to abide by these principles in providing a roadmap to citizenship for 11 million, in making sure our families are reunited and kept together, and many other pieces. So we're excited to move that as well. It already has a tremendous amount of support across the caucus and most importantly across the country. And we've been doing a lot of work just trying to educate people on those core principles.
Thank you. You covered so much there. And I want to go back to at the beginning of the chapter, of your chapter in this book. You really ground in your personal story as an immigrant to this country. And you also say that you believe that immigration has never been simply an issue of policy. It has always been about who we are as a country and what we stand for. And you play this organizer in chief role, I think, in Congress of really trying and working to get other members of Congress to understand that it isn't just a policy matter, that there isn't only a policy imperative or a moral imperative or a political imperative, but that they really have to deliver for people because it is about who we are as a country. And so as you talk about a dysfunctional and inhumane and racist system that has to be transformed, what would you prioritize in terms of all of the different legislative vehicles that you laid out in the first, just moments ago? What do you think is the opening act on immigration that allows us to make progress towards our goals and puts us on closer to the vision laid out in the roadmap to freedom?
Well, the first thing I think, again, President Biden has already executed on, I know with the help of people on this call, which is a bold set of executive actions to not only reverse what Donald Trump did, but to go a little bit beyond as well. I mean, if you look at, the executive actions on numerous levels, they do, of course, reverse what Trump did, but also reminds us and resets our priorities around refugees, around asylees. I mean, this is really, really critical. And I think around family separation, this is not an easy solution. I was the first member of Congress to be in the detention facilities talking to 300 men and women parents, moms and dads who had been separated from their kids, didn't even know where their kids were. And already, at least we have identified through the Biden administration's work, 105 of those kids whose parents had never been identified. If you can imagine that, there's still 500 more. So the task force that President Biden has set up is very, very important around reunification of families. And I think that will be important. But Lorella, I make the case in the book that it is the entire Department of Homeland Security that also needs to be brought in sync with accountability. And we're very, very pleased and proud to see Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas as the nominee for that post. But I believe that even the most excellent secretary is going to struggle with that agency because it is so largely unaccountable. It has so many different pieces within it. And of course, it is a creation of post 9/11. It's not something that's been there for very, very long. It is only a creation of post 9/11. And when you see the culture within the agency, but more importantly, all the different pieces within the agency, I think it makes it very difficult to have that agency be accountable because it's so sprawling and so economically wasteful and has a culture that's embedded in it that's going to be very complicated to restore to a more appropriate culture in a short period of time. So in the book, in my chapter, I make the case that you could take out FEMA and cybersecurity and TSA and return them back to appropriate existing agencies as they were prior to the creation of DHS. And you can also elevate the moral importance of immigration to our country's values by creating a cabinet level department for immigration services and integration. I mean, just imagine an entire immigration and citizenship services agency that's dedicated to advocating for and helping people integrate into our society. And then third, if we separate enforcement from immigration services, I think that is also really important. In the roadmap, we talk about scalable consequences. And that is, it sounds complicated, but all it means is that somebody who steals food to put on the table for their kid because they can't earn a living wage because they're exploited by employers and their undocumented status, that the consequence for that person should be very different from somebody who has committed a serious, and I'm not talking the way felonies are defined today. I'm talking about, things that I think we would all agree are horrific. You can't deport somebody simply for trying to get food on the table. So scalable consequences, judicial discretion, the ability for judges to look at a situation and really figure out what needs to be done. Those are some of the things that are in the Biden bill that I think are very important, and we can't let them go. Not all of those are contained within the other bills. And I do think the administration needs to prioritize detention and enforcement and really reducing the numbers of people that are in detention. We incarcerate immigrants in essentially jails. They're called detention centers, but they are jails in many cases run by county jail systems, but they are also incarceral facilities for people who are simply waiting for a bond hearing or waiting to hear whether or not their papers are going to be processed. So those are all the different pieces that I hope we can move forward and that are outlined in the resolution, but also some pieces are contained within these individual bills.
Thank you for all of that, Congresswoman, because it really is a reminder that we can take a comprehensive approach, even if we can't move a comprehensive bill, and really think about what are all of the tools that are available to us legislatively via the executive branch in organizing culture change, narrative change work, that there isn't one strategy that gets us there, that we really have to look at it comprehensively. And such a good reminder that much of the structures that we have today, they weren't inevitable. They were built that way. There was policy that was made that got us to where we are. And just as we are where we are, we do have tools. We have to continue to build power to bring about a different system. And that's going to require everyone to really get there, and really reorienting towards a system of compliance, as Peter Markowitz also writes, and against and moving away from a system of punishment and extreme punishment for all things and everything. So that is a good transition. Thank you. That is a really good transition to Cecilia. Cecilia, you lay out a framework, and we were just talking about asylum. We were talking about family reunification. You lay out a framework in the book for how the new administration and advocates should reconceptualize asylum and management of border processing, which are complex and challenging issues that you dealt with yourself when you served in the White House under President Obama. Can you talk about your vision and what it would really require to actually achieve it?
Yeah, thank you, Lorella. And it's an honor to be on this panel with so many of my heroes. The asylum system obviously got really decimated by the last administration, but it had enormous challenges even before the Trump administration broke it. And in some respects, what we're dealing with at the border in particular is a reflection of policies that were crafted in some cases 20 years ago or more for a border that is very different from the actual border that we have now. So part of what's required, even with all the immediate work that the Congresswoman outlines, which is obviously tremendously important to the lives of people who frankly are depending on the new administration to get it right away. In addition to the immediate work, I think there's a real need to step back and envision, what do we think if we recognize that the border that we have now was designed for individual adults coming from Mexico for economic reasons, right? That's all of the infrastructure is built for that. Our laws, our policies, our physical facilities are all built for a situation that isn't really what we face now. What we face now really is an influx of people coming with children, families, and they're coming from further away. They're coming from Central America. None of our infrastructure is designed for that. So what we really need is to step back and think through, knowing what we know now about what the pressures are at the border and what they are likely to be in the future. What is the best way? What is the best system of laws that we need? And what is the best way to apply laws that are consistent with our values? I am encouraged because I think the Biden administration appears to share the long-term vision. The problem is they have really difficult problems in the immediate term. But the long-term idea is to recognize and greet people with different facilities and differently trained personnel than what they are greeted by now. Like the typical migrants coming now are not seeking to evade our authorities, which is what it was like 20, 25 years ago. They're actually looking for our authorities so that they can ask for asylum. What if they were greeted by a corps that was actually trained to recognize the needs of people in that situation? And what if we had facilities at the border that were designed to help them cope with what they're confronting? None of this is unattainable, but it means a different mindset with respect to understanding what it is and who it is that's presenting themselves at the border. And it means being willing to invest in different kinds of facilities, different kinds of officials, different kinds of training. And I think very importantly, I think it means partnerships between the government and the non-governmental sector, right? So if you were to use the European model, for example, of something resembling a reception center as opposed to a border patrol lockup, it's a very, very different kind of approach. And if you have large numbers of people requesting asylum, which we have now, and large numbers of unaccompanied children, which we have now, it would require partnerships so that you provide, I think, the kind of housing that we all wish were available now, but which isn't available now. So you have an administration which is trying to do the best it can with a set of tools, which is inadequate to the situation. What if we stepped back and thought about developing the actual tools that are needed for the people who present themselves at the border? I don't think any of this is beyond reach at all. And in fact, I would say we're even on a trajectory to realize that vision. But the immediate challenge is obviously processing the folks who have been stuck in the tens of thousands of folks who've been stuck in Mexico because of the decisions of the Trump administration, creating the capacity to get to decisions on asylum cases much more quickly than we do right now. One of the central challenges of the system is that if you come and ask for asylum, you might not get a hearing for 3 or 4 years. You may or may not have representation, most likely not. And that's not a system which is serving the asylum applicants well. And it's a system which is giving the bad guys who are not interested in anybody coming from any other country the ability to make an argument that the system is broken and should therefore just be trashed, right? We've just lived with 4 years of that, and the human cost of that has been incalculable. So I think we're on that trajectory, but we have to be, I think, good partners to the administration in managing the immediate challenges, and in having the capacity to build the kinds of partnerships with the NGO sector that are going to be needed in order to get to the kinds of facilities and the kind of treatment for the human beings involved that we really need. And that means from the NGO sector, being willing to work in partnership with the government, including a government and an agency, which, as you just heard the Congresswoman describe, could be different and should be different, and not only is not going to be perfect, but is going to have a lot of problems in the short term. So being able to hold the possibility of an affirmative vision and move towards that vision at the same time that we are holding the government accountable for the things that are going to go wrong, and there are going to be plenty of them, is a challenge that I think we collectively face.
And Cecilia, you laid out a lot there, but I'm just curious if you could spend just another minute on scalability of, what the private, public, or civil society government partnership could look like and what it would really take to achieve that.
So I don't think, well, I do think this vision is attainable. I think there's a lot that needs to be developed in civil society and in the relationship between civil society and the government in order to get there. So to use, and this is the situation of unaccompanied children as an example, I'm just deeply familiar with this from my time in government. This administration is trying to create proper shelter space for the unaccompanied kids that they encounter at the border. And you need shelter space because the government's job is to reunite those kids with their families. Like, that's their job under the law. But you need housing for them. You need to house them somewhere. And the obstacles to to finding facilities and being able to use facilities that like I think the people on this call would agree are appropriate for kids are enormous. There are issues around state licensing. There are issues around the capacity of organizations to manage the number of kids. We're talking about tens of thousands of kids a year. It's not like flicking a switch. The infrastructure isn't there. We have to build it. So that means the government, which needs to house kids right now, has to find whatever facilities are available while it looks for partners to help them build the kinds of facilities which should be available, and while it tries to convince the Congress for the resources to do all of these things. So that creates dilemmas for the advocacy community, for the NGO sector, which is not excited about what the government has available to it this minute, and may or may not want to work in partnership to build what the government needs to build. So those are sort of the challenges that we face, but we are a long way away from having the scale of appropriate physical facilities and the personnel with the capacity to manage them well to put up against the need that we face right now. So it's a enormously challenging dynamic, but the thing that gives me hope is that I am confident that this administration cares about the well-being of those kids. And turns out the intentions of the people sitting in those jobs really matters a lot, as we richly learned over the last 4 years. And I'm confident that the advocacy community has the capacity to think in terms of putting those kids first. And I think it's those two factors which give me hope that we can figure out this very difficult thing because it matters so intensely.
Thank you. And I want to stay on this theme and turn to you, Cristina, because your chapter reflects on the need to discard the paradigm that has been at the foundation of immigration legislative proposals for decades, this tying the path to citizenship to an increase in enforcement. And now that we've seen President Biden's bill, do you think that we're making progress? Right? How did we get here? But really, how do we build more power around a frame that rejects not only the trade-off in Congress, but also the broader narrative and political problem of criminalization of immigrants and immigration, really the stigmatization of all immigrants as potential threats to public safety or national security?
Thank you, Lorella. And just first want to say I'm honored to be among the contributors of this book. It's just so timely to have this conversation with everything that's going on, as you just shared. I mean, and to your point about, are we making progress? I will say absolutely yes. And the reason why I start from a positive perspective and owning our power is because, in movements, we tend to rush through the celebration of what we've been able to win and not really sit with how much power we've built. And the fact that we have a bill that, no bill is ever going to be perfect or have everything that we want, but that we have a bill that has finally completely broken away from the paradigm that citizenship needs to come at the cost of more deportation and more detention is a huge legislative breakthrough that happened because we organized over a decade, multiple years of protest, of storytelling, of narrative change work, of policy work, of lobbying work, and we got here. So, for everyone who has organized in the immigrant justice movement, I just want to remind you, this is a moment to own and to celebrate our power. And it's a testament of the power that we have built. Because let's remember that before this bill arrived, the Biden bill, we have had basically years of increased deportation, increased detention, growing resources in the Department of Homeland Security that, as Congresswoman Jayapal mentioned, has gone without accountability and proper oversight for many years. And we have been left without citizenship in many, many, many fights at the national level. So, both parties have really failed at the political strategy here. Under the Obama administration, all of us, we may remember, there was a political belief or an analysis that if you had a tough on enforcement approach, Republicans will come to the negotiating table. They never showed up. And we ended up without legalization and citizenship for folks. So I think we are making progress, and we still have some challenges ahead of us in the fight. I don't refer only to the challenges of how do you move a bill into the reality of becoming a law. Certainly for many of us that have run campaigns at the federal level know the challenges ahead. But I think that the challenge, it's also because we ought to really speak to what we're up against. And unless we really confront and talk about what we're up against, we're just not going to win. The fact of the matter is that the Department of Homeland Security and our immigration system are rooted in white supremacy and systematic racism. Full stop. That's what we're up against. So if we acknowledge what we're up against, then I think that the way that we fight will just get more strategic. And we'll get to this point that you're raising, Lorella, about building power. If we know that what we're up against is an agency that we know, it has been widely reported, has members, has staff and agents who are KKK members of hate groups, there is not only a cultural challenge, but the fact that we are dealing with an agency that has only grown in resources without any accountability. And I think that thanks to movement work, again, like the movement for Black Lives, the country is engaging in a conversation about invest and divest. And I think that the work that the Detention Watch Network, United We Dream, and many in the immigrant justice movement driving a demand to dismantle DHS, to defund DHS, are actually winning traction. And when I entered the movement, these were demands that were seen as like too far out, not realistic demands. But there were people post 9/11 that were really fighting against for the dismantling of DHS. And now that demand is gaining traction. And so I think that we have the challenges of the enormity of what the white supremacy represents, and the growing of white nationalism. But I also believe in the power of our movements, because we're seeing a change. We're seeing how through a campaign, we were able to stop over $7 million to going into DHS. And this was just in the last congressional session under Trump. So I think that there is a lot of hope and opportunity for us to continue to break away from the idea that we need to have more enforcement, more detention, more deportation, and to be able to draw the connections to systems rooted in white supremacy and systematic racism.
There's so much there, Cristina. I'm going to stay on the theme with power as I turn to Deepak here for a second, but just a reminder of the movement ability, not just on immigration, but the kind of national conversation that we're having today, what President Biden has put forward in the American Rescue Package, just the movement's ability to change the politics, to challenge the status quo, to disrupt the status quo, and then to present a different vision for what it takes to actually actualize and really fulfill this promise, this idea of America. It's truly remarkable. And I think it's what we've got, right? We don't have organized money. What we have are organized people. And that's what we have to continue to grow. And it brings me so much joy to know and to ground in the fact that that's the work that we do here, right? It isn't just about developing smart policy proposals, but you actually have to build power to make any of those things real. So Deepak, I'm going to turn to you because you focus so much of your analysis on a power-centered approach. And in the book, you observe that the immigrants' rights movement has something to learn from the ruthless approach Stephen Miller took to governing. And that is truly one centered on power. So can you expand on that idea? What lessons do we have to learn? And how do we use that to power our movement in this moment?
Thank you so much. It's such a joy to be with colleagues that I've worked with for so long, and Cristina and Cecilia and Pramila for all the amazing work they did. And Lorella, you are just a magnificent leader. It is just a joy to see you in this position. It just gives me such confidence that the future is bright for the organization, but for the movement and our people. And I also want to thank Community Change on behalf of Ruth and Penny, my co-editors, for hosting the first kind of pre-launch event for the book, which we think really reflects a tremendous amount of vitality from leading movement actors and academics on the next generation of big ideas and big organizing strategies for this century. So I'm super excited about it. So I am sad to report that I did spend a lot of time researching Stephen Miller for this book. I can report that the man is in fact a vortex of darkness. That is true. And so we know him publicly as a vicious racist whose goal is to uphold white power in America. But he was also a shrewd strategist. And there are a lot of haters, but Miller was a strategic hater. So he used governing power to do two crucial things: to shift narrative and to alter relations of power in society. And I think there is actually something important to learn from that power-centered approach to policy. So at the level of narrative, we all know this, he used the government to tell a story, to reinforce an immigrant threat narrative based in scarcity and fear. He used a language that was about protecting American workers, the cost and crime associated with immigrants, all of it false. And his narrative really provided a bridge between the world he imagines of entrenched white political power and the lack of public support, a majority public support for that vision. He had to find a bridge between those two things. And he also had a major strategy to deliberately weaken the political power of immigrants and their allies. And I think this is really crucial. So increasing fear and repression demobilizes people. Delaying naturalization of eligible immigrants who want to become citizens reduces the political power of immigrants. Fewer people vote. And by reducing immigration itself, he's really making an effort to slow down or stop the demographic change in the country for a multiracial new majority to find its voice. So we tend to think demographic change is irreversible. He was making a serious play to reverse it. And in a country where tens of thousands of votes or thousands of votes or hundreds of votes decide election, these kinds of moves to alter math, political math, demographic math, have a huge impact. So the implications for us, I think, are a lot of what Cristina was talking about in terms of a narrative shift to totally reject this immigrant threat narrative. And a colleague, Ruth Milkman, has a chapter in the book which talks about the falseness of that economic scarcity argument and demonstrates it, that it is false. And we replace it with some bridge narratives of our own about the centrality of immigration to American identity and renewal, the shared interests of immigrant and US-born workers, really a working class, race-conscious, race-forward politics. So the other piece of the implication to me is that I think our side needs to look at immigration, not just in policy terms, but in terms of power. So how do the things that we prioritize reduce fear and increase a sense of confidence and agency among immigrants themselves? So they're emboldened to participate, to rally, to march, to engage in public programs. Does the policy we're pursuing close the gap between the potential power of immigrants and their actual power in politics and society? Legalization, naturalization, those kinds of things. So how do we use our political capital in such a way that we are altering those relations of power in concrete, substantial ways? And if we do that, that will result in better policy over time. So to me, this is a little bit the question you asked to Pramila. It means that rather than looking through policy as though, does it meet everything on our list of what we want? we're super honest that we don't have the power to get everything we want yet. So we're going to use the power we do have to increase the power of immigrants in society, which will allow us to get further and further towards that vision. And I think that perspective could be the basis for a lot of strategic unity among our communities.
Whew. Okay, you just dropped the mic on a lot of things, Deepak, as you usually do. But there's this one last piece here around power building policy. And I feel sometimes we can get caught up in the debate. That's really a debate we end up having amongst ourselves that isn't always honest about our power and very sharp and clear about what the path to victory looks like to deliver on policy that builds our movement's power and that delivers concrete change in people's lives. And I actually, I want to go to you, Cristina, for a second, because I think that DACA is a perfect case study for recognizing what we have the capacity and the power to win, for making a set of strategic decisions that were not easy, that were hard because it meant we weren't going to win for everyone, but being very clear about how winning on what might be smaller policy or narrower policy wins actually helped to build power, changed lives, and moved the conversation in this country on immigration, right? So what lessons do we have to learn about that we need to apply to the moment that we're in, and what we must in fact deliver that puts us closer to that vision?
Oh, such a juicy question, especially because we are in a moment where, bills are being dropped, votes are being taken in Congress. I will say that there's two things I want to share on this question about lessons. One is that I want us as a movement, and we need as a movement, to not underestimate our power or to overestimate our power as well. And I often feel that we underestimate or overestimate, and then our strategies and our tactics suffer. So I think that when you look at DACA, it wasn't even something that I think some people in the movement thought that we could win. So there's an example of, underestimating our power. And I also think that there is a healthy tension, sometimes not so healthy, around what is the role of movements and how do you create the outside conditions for negotiations that happen in the room where the votes and decisions are happening. When we were in the thick of the DACA fight, let's remember, the movement wasn't demanding DACA per se. When we look at what led to the DACA victory, it was the DREAM Act campaign, the legislation that would have provided, pathway to citizenship for people like me at the time. Now a lot of the young people that were the pioneers of the immigrant youth movement are adults, we're viejas, veterans in the movement. But at the time, I would have benefited from that version of the DREAM Act. The DREAM Act fails in 2010, and we know the story that it wasn't just Republicans, it was also, Democrats in that missing of votes that we needed to pass. But it is that moment where our movement made the strategic choice that we couldn't walk away without anything. We knew that Obama had made a promise. We knew the Latino vote was important. And we also knew that you have folks like Senator Rubio, at the time, because the Senator Rubio today is completely different, but at the time, who wanted to also claim a victory for Republicans on legalization for young immigrants. And we were strategic enough to engage with all of those stakeholders and make a calculation that even though the conventional wisdom in the movement was that we couldn't win DACA, that there was no way, that it had never been done before, we challenged that conventional wisdom because we made that calculation of power analysis chart that many of us as organizers do. And that's how we landed in the DACA victory. So what I will say today is that we should not get confused with access and power. having access and having conversations and going to these meetings to negotiate around these bills does not mean that we have the power. So as organizers and strategists, let's have a real assessment of the power that we have right now. And let's understand the roles that different folks in the movement are going to play. So we need actually to support the movements that are going to be demanding to abolish ICE, that are going to be demanding for citizenship for all, because that is going to create the conditions for the most strategic negotiations to happen so that we can get the broadest and most inclusive win right now. And I think that understanding the dynamics between both and having a communication between both and a strategic coordination is going to help us to get to a legislative breakthrough. And lastly, Lorella, that when it comes to power, it's people power, it's narrative power, and it's also electoral power. And we cannot come into this legislative conversation without remembering that Latinx voters, Indigenous, Black voters, like you reminded us at the beginning of this panel, are responsible for the victories that we saw in 2020. So from that place of power, let's negotiate and let's push for the most that we can get.
Can I build on that, Lorella?
Please.
So I agree so much with Cristina's perspective on power and how we both overestimate and underestimate what it's able to produce. And I really, really deeply agree with Cristina, what you just said about kind of connecting power also to the conversation sort of in the room, if you're able to engage with the folks who are ultimately making policy decisions. That, I think we dramatically underestimate the significance of that, at least from where I sit, right? So I've been both a movement person as well as in a position of governing, and it wasn't sufficient on DACA specifically. I mean, the power and the DREAM Act movement was, you are absolutely right, tremendously important, laid the groundwork for what happened, there's no question. And the courage of people in telling their own stories and laying their own lives forward is like the most powerful tool I've ever seen wielded in support of immigrants. But in the end, I also, on the inside, had to construct a policy rationale. Like I couldn't go either to the president or to the legal team and say, they have power and they are demanding a thing, and have enough wherewithal for it to happen. And so that the interplay between power and what's the policy rationale and what are the levers that can be pulled and at what time, all of that is essential. And you're right, you sort of alluded to the notion that sometimes it's a comfortable conversation and sometimes it's not. And it's worth being honest about that, because power helps us create running room, but we also have to know what the policy rationale is, and the better we understand what the tools are that the policymakers in Congress are working with, and what their constraints are, and what the policymakers in the executive branch are working with, and what their constraints are, the more we will be able to layer victory upon victory until we get to the vision that we're talking about. But we have to be willing to understand what the step 1, 2, and 3 victories are in order to get to the bigger things, because sometimes we're impatient that we're not realizing the whole vision. And that interplay, I think, is everything. And we have opportunity now because people fought for it and built it, but we have to use it strategically because people's lives depend on it.
Yeah, there's a lot here. Cristina, I want to elevate this. Everyone in the movement is sort of plays a necessary role, right? If you sort of think of big movement as opposed to just individual organizations. And so even back in the day, like I remember Endalon's Not One More campaign. I remember just this past 3 years, people calling for the abolition of ICE, right? And so some of those things help to create room, and they help to challenge the things that we've grown accustomed to that we treat as normal. And then you also need people in the movement who are able to more naturally or decide that the role they're going to play is sort of being the really sitting in the inside outside, knowing and recognizing that access does not equal power, but that actually doing the role of inside outside strategy that at the end of that really is like the goal of that is to deliver for the people, which is why people get elected to office. And so often it's all about holding on to electoral power or serving one's political interest, as opposed to, like, I think what often happens in DC is people forget why they went there to begin with, right? They forget that they are there to actually deliver policy and change in people's lives. And I think that's a good reminder. And Cecilia, I think lessons learned about, how does the movement help to position and to create the room for people on the inside to make the argument and to make the case? Because in any given day, I remember this from being on Hillary's campaign, on any given day, there are 50 crises, right? On any given day, there are 50 things that people on the inside are running to try to make possible and to solve. And so you need people on the inside having the argument and having the tools that they need to move the conversation internally. So I'm very aware of time. I want to make sure that we get to the Q&A, but maybe turn to all of you to ask you how, on this question and on this conversation about also the politics of immigration, I'm curious about how each of you understands the appeal of Trump and Trumpism. And, where are the Democrats really on this issue? What is the political strategy that the movement and its allies should follow in the years to come to prevail on policy? So maybe I can go to you, Cecilia, first, then Cristina and Deepak, and turn into the Q&A.
Boy, it's a great question, and it's it takes you to a painful place, but it's actually pretty important to understand the painful place. It feels more important. I mean, it's not, at some level, Trumpism was shocking and new, but also not surprising and not new, right? It was the flowering of something that's been going on really since forever, but which gained visibility, notoriety, traction in these last 4 years, and is obviously not going away. I think of it as the ultimate and most horrifying expression of something, of a real thing that I really think we have to grapple with, which is that, look, most people in the country want the system to make sense to them, and for most people it doesn't make sense to them because it's broken, right? It doesn't make sense to anybody. And most people in this country, including people who don't live with these things, who don't see it as part of their lives, want to know that it's going to be orderly and fair. And I actually think we have the vision which provides orderly and fair and generous and consistent with our values and worthy of our heritage as a nation of immigrants. But the frustrating thing is that one of the things which made him effective, and it pains me to admit it, but he was, is this notion that they captured the notion of order, and in the most horrifying way, and put us in the position of being able to be framed as the people who were not for that, which is neither true nor fair. And part of our challenge, I think, includes obviously lifting up the sort of humanity of the people that we are talking about, of what this debate is about, but also offering the country what I think most of the country wants, which is to just know that it's a system that has rationality to it and that it's going to treat people fairly and that there will be rules and they will be followed. And I think we should own that and provide it because we can, and I think we can do it in a way that is generous and that remembers that the human beings that we're talking about are human beings.
Mm-hmm. I'll just build on what Cecilia said here. I mean, the system has been designed for what it's doing, and to the point around making the connections to the long history of systematic racism in this country, it's important. And I think that if we as a movement, so to your question about like, what do we make of Trumpism? How do we move forward from here? I think that, again, being sober about what we're up against and actually, make the connections. I'm not sure that we have gotten yet to the point where the American public understands the connection of our immigration system and the injustices that we have seen to our long history of systematic racism and a country founded in white supremacy and genocide of Native Americans. And there is a big opportunity in this moment when, thanks to the movement for Black Lives, over 70% of Americans believe racism is a problem. 70% of Americans. As an organizer, think about that on top opportunity to organize all those people that hit the streets last year, to organize all those people that believe racism is a problem. And I think that that is how we defeat Trumpism, which, to the point that Cecilia made, and I agree with her completely on this, Trump is just a symptom of these deeper foundational injustices that our country is rooted in. But I think that the opportunity is to organize the unorganized right now. And the movement, I will say, we need to keep doing some of the things that we have been doing already. Create space, invite people to imagine the things that we have not been able to imagine yet. Mobilize people, electorize our fights, get people to vote, hold people accountable. And when I think about this moment, when it comes to the legislation, let's just be real. Republicans ain't coming to the table to negotiate on no bill, not on immigration, not on other things, quite frankly. So what is the 50-vote strategy for Democrats? And this is where our movement needs to hold those that we send to Congress accountable to the promises that they've made. And I think that that's how we're going to continue to build power and to change, not just on immigration, because I think a danger is to isolate immigration from everything else that we're seeing right now.
Yeah, I totally agree with both Cristina and Cecilia about this. And I think we're kind of at this pivotal moment right now, whether the Democrats are going to grapple with the party that they actually face, which is quite different than the party that they wish they faced. Some of them, at least. And so we're not done with this kind of authoritarian turn. I think we might actually be towards the front end of it still. And if you believe that to be the case, then two priorities rise to the top: democracy reform and voting rights, and immigration reform. If you actually believe that we are in that kind of pitched battle, then really the future depends on those two things. It depends on whether there's a free exercise of the franchise, because Republicans are already moving to shut that down in states around the country, and whether the political expression of this new American potential majority can find its voice, and legalization and the path to citizenship is a huge, huge part of that. So after January 6th, my views on this kind of intensified. I basically came to think that upholding multiracial democracy in this country depends on the extent to which there's a recognition of the seriousness of the threat, as Cristina says, and a willingness to do what's necessary to meet it. We see that, as Cecilia said, the failure to solve the problem doesn't make it go away. It actually feeds the beast. And Mitt Romney's introduction, I think, of this minimum wage proposal to increase the minimum wage and insisting on anti-immigrant provisions being attached to it, that is the threat we face. So the failure to address immigration doesn't make that threat go away. It actually gives Republicans fodder to work with. So I think that's the sort of deep political psychological shift that has to happen, that the movement, as Cristina says, has to impress on the party. Maybe just the last thing to say is, that one of the big arguments of the book is that the challenges we face on immigration are like, we have the old challenges, which are still here and need to be addressed, of legalizing millions of people. And now we have a whole set of new challenges. We have millions of climate refugees who are going to be coming from the global south. We have a care crisis. We have a demographic change. And so getting this right is going to require building a politics to welcome millions and millions more people to this country. And so the Democrats solving this immediate political problem will set the stage for the bigger conversation, I think, that is the conversation of the century, which is, can we once again welcome millions and millions of people with open arms? Because we're going to need to.
Mm.
which makes it a challenge that we are fighting so hard over kind of the results of the system that's already broken. Like if you think about what Congresswoman Jayapal was saying at the beginning, a lot of that addressed what we should be doing because we have 11 million people here without immigration status, and how we should do a better job of addressing that, including with respect to how we apply enforcement standards to that. I mean, in some ways, it's a terrible and enormous problem, but we're spending so much policy energy and attention on the thing which we haven't been able to fix for 20 years. And that is also depleting our capacity to address what Deepak just outlined, which is the migration challenges to come. And they're not just to come, they're already here. Like the folks coming from Central America, in many cases, are already climate refugees. They're already fleeing what happened to the coffee crop in Guatemala, and already fleeing, 2 huge hurricanes that happened within 3 weeks of each other in Honduras. Like this is already here, and we're still fighting the 20-year battle behind us, and just beginning to address what's in front of us.
Yeah, it's like we're playing catch up, and playing catch up and only catch up does not allow us to really get honest and real about the challenges ahead and how we actually have to reform our system so that it can meet the scale of the crisis of the present and really the future. Right now, I feel here, I'm going to shift to questions, but one thought I have from this conversation is, can Democrats in this moment, are they ready to be unapologetically pro-immigrant? Right, to ensure that the rhetoric is actually matched and met by actions, and this is where it's more than, with all the good that has come from President Biden introducing his bill, that mere introduction is not enough, that it falls short of the promise, the commitment, and the need of this moment. And Deepak, on some of the things that you were talking about, and both democracy reforms and immigration reform, I find it's an important conversation, especially coming out of last night. And the parliamentarians ruling on 15 in reconciliation. And just a reminder that arcane Senate rules are standing in the way of the American people. And we actually need a government that is responsive to the needs of the people. And I don't know why there's this obsession with rules, meaning that their belief in the system is completely divorced from what they should be delivering for the American people, to ensure that children's lives are made better, to ensure that we actually tackle poverty, and that the measure of success in this moment is not what anyone thinks about the parliamentarian, but it really is about, at the end of the day, are we doing everything that we can to deliver for people and move the needle, right? Because at the end of the day, no one's going to talk about the filibuster or the parliamentarian on the ground. All they're trying to figure out is, how do we put food on the table? How do we have a roof over our head? How do we make sure that we're not just living with poverty wages, but can move into dignified, how do we make sure that people respect our work and that they don't just thank us, as Mary Kay Henry says, right? But that they pay us, protect us, and respect us. So I'm going to shift here. I'm so grateful for this conversation. We are not done yet. I'm going to shift here to the Q&A, and I'm just going to ask this question. It says, I'm wondering about Democrats in wobbly districts and their positions on some of the legislative measures. Might Democrats, rather than Republicans, block them? Congresswoman Jayapal reflected on bipartisan resistance to prior immigration policy reform bills. Can you count on Democratic votes? Are there Democratic votes to push back?
Well, I'm happy to start on that. I mean, I feel like you, in some ways, Lorella, your comments were, to me, like the perfect answer, that the people on the other side of this election are not going to be sympathetic to an answer that you promised us X, Y, and Z. You didn't deliver X, Y, and Z because you needed 60 votes in the Senate, and the Senate parliamentarian, who is that? Said no. Like, would Mitch McConnell say that if there was like a tax cut that the corporations wanted and he came, oh, I'm so sorry, Senate parliamentarian, No, can't have that tax cut. Like, what world is that, right? So it seems to me that the question is how fast there's a realization that people's fates are linked. That is to say, the Democrats as a party's fates are linked to each other, that if they don't deliver and they stumble, it's not like Kirsten Sinema, because she supports the filibuster, thinks she's going to survive. And that's craziness. That's a crazy position. But the Democrats' fates are also linked to the power of their core constituencies, especially Black folks, immigrants, people of color, women. And to the extent that they are not delivering for those folks, they're also undoing their own governing power. Like, it's not just about being nice to us, it's actually about a strategy to sustain their own power. So I think the realization is happening. Cristina pointed to some of the progress, like decoupling and punitive enforcement, like this, but will it happen fast enough? Like this is, we got to move through all the cycles of grief that people may have for some vaunted era of bipartisanship that is long ago gone. They're going to have to move through that very, very fast. And that's the concern, but that's also, I think, movements insisting on not the process, but the results is really critical.
I completely agree with that. And it is also true that we have never lived in an era where 100% of the Democrats in Congress were pro-immigrant, ever, right? I've been in DC now more than 30 years. I've been at this for a really long time. I've only ever seen one bill that got the votes of all of the Democrats in the chamber, and that was the Senate immigration reform of 2013. And it was a miracle that we got all of the Democrats to support it. And some of those, those Democrats who are still in the Senate now, I wonder if some of them would support the same bill or a similar bill now, right? Cristina mentioned we lost 5 Democrats on that DREAM Act vote in 2010. We fought like hell to make sure it was only 5, right? Like we should not assume that because a Democrat is a Democrat, they are therefore on the pro-immigrant side of the ledger. We have to fight for those votes, which is why partly why the immigration reforms that have gone through have been bipartisan. So this is about a combination of building power. It's about a combination of understanding what those members need to tell their constituents in order to be on the right side of an immigration bill, and making sure we have supported those arguments, given them the capacity to make them, and backed it up with power.
I just want to add quickly here, plus what Deepak and Cecilia said, and to this last point around that we haven't really seen a whole party sort of unified and being pro-immigrant, Cecilia. I mean, let's just look at a vote that happened a couple of weeks ago, early this month, with 8 Democrats that voted with Republicans on excluding COVID relief checks for undocumented workers. And some of those were also senators, were Latino voters. Latina voters played a huge role in getting them elected, like Kelly in Arizona, like Sinema in Arizona, Hickenlooper in Colorado. So I think that there needs to be a confrontation with Democrats, particularly with those that really depend on the voters from our communities to hold those seats, to be reminded of the accountability, and that siding with Republicans is not what they were sent to Congress to do by their voters. But I also think that it is about political will, not just of the Democratic Party. I think also of President Biden in this case. Like, imagine if we were to try an immigration strategy where the president is the first and number one most powerful champion for the issue. And the championing is not just about introducing a bill. I mean, think about President Obama and how he championed for healthcare reform, even when the issue was somewhat unpopular. We were in the middle of an economic crisis, and the support of the American public wasn't there. But what did you see Obama do? talking about it, campaigning on it, going across the country, speeches, State of the Union, fiercely speaking about stories of Americans that will benefit from healthcare reform. We need to try that too. And that is where I think the political leadership and will of our current president right now can play a huge role in getting us through this challenge, even with his own party.
Mhm. We are nearing the end of our time together here. I want to remind everyone to purchase the book. I want to have this conversation happen more often. Cecilia, Deepak, Cristina, and Congresswoman Jayapal, we don't do this enough of really pausing and reflecting. What are the lessons learned, and what does this moment really require of us? And what does the moment really call for? And how do we really look power in the eye and understand what it is, how we must wield it in this moment? So I believe that the roadmap that we've got to climb, right? That even with the power that we have built, we have a climb, we have threats. You're talking, Deepak, about the rise of authoritarianism in our country. And my hope, actually, it's not just my hope. It's more that we will continue to organize and remind elected officials why they got to where they are and what the expectation is. And we are also here, ready and willing to work with them, to collaborate and to deliver. But we will not, at the end of the day, movements are not accountable to the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. They're accountable to the people. They are responsible for building and delivering with the people. And that's really our charge in this moment, to bring the ideas to the table, to come in the spirit of collaboration, and to also hold power accountable. Right? And I believe we've got this opportunity in this moment. It's not just about thanking people. It's not just about thanking essential workers. It's not enough to say that you're pro-immigrant, to lay out a vision, but if you want it enough, how hard are you willing to work for it, to fight for it, and to do everything in your power to deliver for the people? So with that, I want to just go to each of you for your final comment. I'm not going to say anything else. Your final comment of, what do you leave us with? And then we'll watch a quick 60 second, I almost said 60 minute, don't get scared, 60-second video and wrap up. So Deepak, I want to go to you. Just a few words, what you leave us with.
Yeah, I think this is the time, this next year, this next few years, where we can begin the process of building a radically new immigration system that is situated in the context of a broader fight for economic and racial justice. I think the possibility is really there for the first time in a long, long time. The conditions are right. The leadership is there to do it. And I think it will require us to bring a kind of seriousness about power and understanding how short-term moves that we make and choices we make relate to the long-term destination we need to get to. So a new level of sophistication, but I believe the movement actors are completely ready to do that. And, the country has this self-image of being the most welcoming country on earth for immigrants and refugees. Let's actually make the country live into that self-image. Let's actually make the country be who it sometimes thinks it is. And I think we can make huge progress.
Cecilia?
Completely agree with that. I think we have, not just that we have enormous opportunity now, but that we have an imperative to move what we can move now, because we've learned so much about how much lies in the balance in terms of people's lives, in terms of our own future as a country. So I completely second what Deepak said about making sure that we move on all of the fronts, that we leverage power as well as engagement. Look, we have movement people in the administration who understand these challenges in the same way that people on this call do. We have to both work in partnership as well as push in sophisticated ways, and we can't let any opportunity stay on the table. It's too important.
I will just say, reminded by Frederick Douglass' wise words: power concedes nothing without a demand. And I believe that our movements ought to continue to put the demands forward and to be unapologetic about what our country and our people deserve. And that's just not just immigrants or with the issue of immigration reform, because I think we got to remember that our opposition and Trump and Stephen Miller and all these folks were unapologetic about driving a white nationalist agenda. And the world and the country is witness to it. And so we ought to have the courage to be equally, if not more aggressively, unapologetic about the country that we want to build, which is a multiracial democracy that works for all of us, and that includes immigrants, regardless of immigration status.
Thank you. Thank you all for joining. We're going to go to this video and we will see you in the next conversation, which will happen. Let's go to the video, Kyle.
Total and complete shutdown of Muslims.
We have endured years of anti-immigrant policies, brutality, and racism. But immigrants have been organizing for a new era.
We shall write an American story of hope, not fear, of unity, not division, of light, not darkness.
We have a once-in-a-generation opportunity to remake our nation's broken immigration system for immigrants and for everyone.
This project began as both a conference and a book, and the focus was immigration policy for the post-Trump era. And we brought together a lot of different voices: scholars, activists, policy experts, and also elected officials.
So there is an opening here for us as advocates to change minds and shape policy. That's why I've called for essential workers to be able to get a path to citizenship.
Immigration Matters shows how we can achieve justice for today's immigrants and tomorrow's, and redeem America's promise.